Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Gaming Materialists. My name is Djene Bajalan, and I am your host for today, talking about all things games. That includes miniatures, role-play games, but not video games, because we're boomers and we don't touch the computers. Well, we do, but we're not going to touch that with a barge pole. Well, today we have a fantastic, interesting show for you today, talking with a veteran of the industry. But first, I'm going to bring on my co-host. He is the most handsome man in left-wing, Marxist, leftcom adjacent, and critical theory adjacent podcasting. He is the one, the only. He is the Black Sean King. He is C. Derek Varn. Hey, Varn, how are you doing?
Hey, it's easy to be the most handsome man in a field that consists of like two people.
Hey, who are you up against? Who are you up against?
I don't know. I guess actually, if you include Sean from Anti-Father, I'm not the most handsome man. But
oh yeah, it's Sean from Anti. He's a very handsm man.
It would be Sean, then probably me,
and then Doug at the bottom.
But we're talking about games, not rank most
handsome,
attractive,
most attractive theory podcaster. Well, I think maybe we need to do that show in the future. Well, everybody, we have a really great guest tonight. He is a veteran of 20 years in the gaming industry, managing independent game store. He's my local games master man, I suppose. I mean, what would you call your local, the local manager of your local game store? What would you call that? Do you have the special role for them? The master of gamery, the prince of games, the king of games. He is the one, the only Carl Morgan, manager of Metagames. Welcome, Carl, to Gaming Materialists. So we're doing good. We're glad to have you on the show. And I've actually been wanting to talk to you for a while about gaming, because a lot of the discussions we have about games, the games industry, obviously focus on the big companies and the products that people are attached to. So we've talked about things like Games Workshop. We've talked about Dungeons and Dragons. We've talked about a variety of different topics. But on Gaming Materialists, one of the things we want to do is actually talk about the political economy, to use the appropriate Marxian terminology, of the games industry, which of course includes the purveyors of games like yourself. You are a manager of a game store, and you've been in the industry for a significant amount of time. So, that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you. So I kind of wanted to start by asking you, to tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got into the games industry and how you became a manager of a store, and perhaps go on to talk a little bit about how that has changed, perhaps both in material terms and how the business functions, and also in cultural terms, in how people perceive of game stores and the paraphernalia of board games and miniature games and role-play games.
Oh boy, that's a little bit to unpack. So I've been in, like you said, I've been working here about 20 years, if not, I think it's a little over 20 years now, long time. When I first got in, it was just like, hey, I'm going to work part-time at this game store. At the time, I was teaching high school art and working at a college library and working here. Eventually, the high school job didn't pan out to, like, I was working there part-time, didn't pan out to what I wanted. The college library job was a full-time job, but not really what I wanted to do. And then everything fell into place for me to take over working on a regular basis here. And then it's just sort of blossomed from there as far as work goes. Before that, I had worked in various collectible type things. We worked at another store that did a little bit of games, mostly comic books and sports cards. I had come from the music side of things. I actually started, with like a record store, and they brought me into that store. My previous job as a guy to sort of take over the music stuff, and then it just sort of everything sort of morphed and then settled down here.
And you manage the store, but not only do you manage the store, you've run tournaments and things like that as well.
Yeah, I've run conventions and tournaments and that kind of thing, and that's been pretty. It's been a lot of fun. That's probably a lot more stressful than running a game store. And I was focusing on just doing one big event over the course of a year with a lot of like some feeder events that would go into it. But we would have like one big wrap up tournament event at the end of the year, and like at the peak was bringing in closer to 600 people. So that was a lot to manage, but trying to manage the game store and do that was a lot on my plate, and I got out just in the nick of time a couple of years before the coronavirus hit.
So how would you say, at least in terms of the types of companies you deal with, the types of products you sell, have you noticed a change over the last 20 years in terms of taste preferences, and also the way that the companies interact with independent stores?
Oh, it's definitely been a huge change from like when I started. It was pretty typical. I mean, we had always here at the store have trying to take a note to try to make the store more appealing to not just the average gamer. We wanted to be like the joke is like, if we can make the soccer moms comfortable coming in, we can, make anybody comfortable, because like your prototypical gamers don't care as much, if the store isn't well lit or smells the best or is quite as clean as, because they just want to come and play. They'll endure all that other stuff. But if we can make mom happy when she drops off her kids, then that is good for everybody. But it's over the time has changed, where it was like your typical gamers and a little bit of mom and dad coming in, to now it's like a good mix. Like these kids have grown up and have families, and we've had kids that have started out playing anywhere from 40K to Magic the Gathering to Dungeons and Dragons, are now bringing their kids in to learn how to play. And so it's sort of, been cultivated through, gamers and now their new families. And now because of that, it's become much more of a normalized thing in society, as opposed to, the stereotypical, like guys in their mom's basement playing D&D.
Do you ever have any trouble with those guys who are, perhaps playing, they perhaps have a perception of what the game store is and that it's their place, and they are hostile towards interlopers? Or do you think generally people are pretty open to the expansion of the player base?
I think I would say 95% of the people, maybe, and probably more than that, are pretty cool with like anybody coming in and playing. Really try hard not to be like a gatekeeper of any sort of kind, and try to make sure other people are doing that, because you don't want somebody who's brand new in any game, doesn't matter their background at all, coming in and being like, well, that was fun, but these guys were being dicks to me, so I'm not going to come back.
Right. Well,
have we noticed a significant gender or age shift? I mean, one of the things that I have read but haven't confirmed, I've just read it anecdotally, that the gaming industry 40 years ago was mostly like teenage boys. The gaming industry 20 years ago was probably people in their 30s and 40s, and the gaming industry now is all over the place. Is that reflected in your customer base?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty spot on. when I first started, it was your typical high school to college age males. Um, and as time went on, and that's probably a lot to do with board games becoming a little more prevalent, where like if you look at our percentage of what we would sell, back in the day it was a lot of Magic the Gathering, a lot of role-playing games, decent amount of miniature games, and a little bit of board games. And now it's still a good chunk of Magic the Gathering, but board games are becoming a much bigger percentage of that. And because of that, and because board games aren't really focused on one gender or anything, you see a large female populace playing that. And also, like, to be honest, like Dungeons and Dragons with 5th edition, whether you're a fan of it or not, has brought more people back into the hobby than anything. And when you got like shows like Stranger Things on TV, and everything is just normalizing it. So I'm seeing more women running games now than I ever have, and people playing, and it's pretty well-rounded groups. And it's not just, hey, I'm going to go hang out with the guys this weekend and play D&D. It's people are getting together with their girlfriends or wives, and it's well mixed groups of people playing, and it's not just like the creepy dudes in the basement.
I've thought a lot about that. What do you think 5th Ed really did differently? I mean, because 4th Ed was such a flop.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of 4th edition. I'm one of the few. 5th edition they were smart on how they approached it. They went to the players and said, hey, we want to make an edition and we want everybody's input. And they seemingly took the best of all the different editions. They took, sort of like the storytelling emphasis of like 2nd edition, the core rules of 3rd, and then like more of the balance of 4th edition. And they jammed it all together and made it an easier to learn product. And they just seemed to hit the right notes, where it's a game that isn't as daunting to learn how to play as like 3rd edition was so math heavy at times that some people would just get lost, or you would play with people who would take advantage of the system and just try to min-max everything and made it not fun to play. And 4th edition definitely had its issues, but with 5th it was the right place at the right time, sort of a lightning in a bottle thing, just with the maturing of that crowd of people that played, and now having families, and just happened to hit with a system that it was like, oh, I can teach my kids how to play this. Right. And it's not something you have to like take a college course into learning.
One of the things about 5th edition, and then I'll drop the 5th edition questions, but it is interesting how much of its supplements are based off of like deep nostalgia, like because there's so many of the supplements that are like referencing things all the way back to the 70s and 80s. But that hasn't seemed to alienate new players at all, which is kind of a gift. Maybe it's also the incorporation of Magic the Gathering, its formal settings, and Wizard actually combining its IP or whatever. But it does seem to be it's interesting how much nerd shit there is in 5th edition, and yet how it doesn't seem to suffer in the same ways that previous attempts to do that have suffered.
Yeah, I've like I still am amazed, like when you've got like we've had like some kid, and it's harder for me to judge ages, but they looked like they were in high school, like high school or early college. Group of kids came in, and they were a mix of like guys and girls coming in buying D&D books and just listening to them, how much they know. And I think it's one of those rabbit hole things. They get invested in it, and they start hunting out, like lore, and you'll hear them talking about like, and it's the same thing with Games Workshop. You'll have people that go down these rabbit holes of YouTube videos, and it's just like YouTube videos based on the lore of it, and they get super interested and tied into it because of that. And then they want to play, and they want to do, more than just watch a YouTube video.
That's a really interesting point. Oh, go ahead, Varn. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying the observation about the YouTube videos I think is really interesting. I mean, obviously with Dungeons and Dragons, things like Geek and Sundry and obviously Critical Role were extremely important in giving people a vision of what a game would look like, and also making it like not look nerdy. You have like beautiful people with excellent acting skills doing it, and it's, if you enjoy that kind of thing, that's something that can appeal to everybody. But I think what you raise about the lore videos is extremely important, because this proliferation of YouTube content creation has been like a huge free marketing for Dungeons and Dragons, for Games Workshop, for anything which has some kind of sort of historical lore that you can dig up and make a YouTube video on. And it's a really remarkable thing. It's weird as I get older, people are talking about, that box set, the first box set of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, the one with the elves and the goblins, as if it's some kind of ancient mythical artifact, when it was like, oh, I got that for Christmas one year. But suddenly all these things have like an interesting cachet, and there's this huge free publicity that gets people into kind of an ecosystem. And of course, as we know how YouTube works, you watch one lore video and the next thing you know, all your YouTube recommendations are like that dude who, what's his name, Jordan with a P, who does
Jordan with a PH, and like Nerd Foundry and
like is
you can tell I've actually done this. I've gone down this rabbit hole.
How did the player base take the combination though of the Magic the Gathering, which, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I would assume Magic the Gathering is probably one of the biggest proportions of your sales, as it's such a like popular game. How did it take like the combination with D&D? Was it Magic the Gathering players who happened to play D&D who played it, or did it spread the appeal of like Magic the Gathering? Did those two things synergize?
I don't know how much, like, you definitely had. So Magic right now is in a very weird spot where it's a much more casual game than it used to be. Like 5-6 years ago, it was very tournament oriented, and now it's very casual. Play is king, and this, they've got a variant called Commander that drives the format. When they, and I'd even heard in the industry, I don't know how many years ago at a trade show, it's like Wizards of the Coast didn't want to ever mix the two because they just thought they were cannibalizing their own clientele by, if we did a Magic D&D supplement, it would be bad for D&D and vice versa. And now, in this last year, we've had Magic supplements for D&D. They're fine. And you've got D&D in Magic the Gathering now too. They did a whole set that was the Forgotten Realms set. So, and that was super popular, but it I think it helped Magic more than it helped D&D, because the D&D players are going to buy no matter, what they have, no matter what it is, because it's just more content for them. And they, if you're running your own game, as an example, Strixhaven is the last book, and that's their, for lack of a better term, their Hogwarts. It's a magical school thing. The D&D players, the hardcore players, don't care if it's Strixhaven or whatever. They can rename it, they can reskin it to whatever they want and use that material. But it is what it is. They did a Theros book that was very sort of a Greek god oriented thing. That's a Magic the Gathering setting. The D&D players love that because it's just more gods that they can use and at work in their game. So it's not to them, it's just another book to use. Where you get a few Magic players coming over going, oh, this is interesting. The D&D players are just like, hey, it's another book. That's cool. But I think when you look at the two games, Magic was helped more by bringing in more casual people with the Forgotten Realms set than vice versa.
Right.
So one thing I've wondered about this, there has been these cycles of basically the RPG world goes in cycles around the success or failure of D&D at any given time. Like White Wolf, for example, coming up does seem to be somewhat directly related to the decline of TSR. Um, uh, but since the open license and since D&D 5th edition has still kind of maintained that attitude, has D&D brought other games up, or has it suppressed them in sales?
I think you're like, when it comes to role playing games, now that you get this whole group of people that have gotten into role playing through 5th edition, and we're now starting to see them opening up to other types of games because they realize that like D&D is great, but there's other stuff out there. So like, I think in the last 4-6 months, we're starting to see a bigger increase in like the Call of Cthulhu books. The Dune role playing game, it's sitting on the shelf, and we had a couple come in tonight, and they were just like, "Oh, hey, look, it's a Dune role playing game." They know what a role playing game is, and they know what Dune is. So they put the two and two together, and they are more interested now. So it's not like there's more open to trying out that kind of stuff, and people now, a huge difference now compared to like 10 years ago. You would have people like, "Oh, I just want to play 3rd edition D&D," and it was more about the mechanics. And now it's just like, oh, they're looking for a cool role playing game, and they don't care as much about the mechanics. And I think that anybody that plays a lot of role playing games are like that. You find a good group, it doesn't matter what game you play. The game's going to be fun if you got a good group.
How's Pathfinder navigating this transformation? Since Pathfinder briefly eclipsed Dungeons and Dragons during 4th edition era and became kind of people's favorite game, Pathfinder seems to be in decline, or would that be an unfair assessment? Do people still
definitely in a decline as far as sales go? I mean, at least on our end now, and that it's so when the split happened with 3rd and 4th edition and Pathfinder, and a lot of people went to Pathfinder because they knew what 3rd edition D&D was all about, and it was just more of the same, and they didn't really have to relearn anything. And you had a lot of the old school players who were just like, "I'm never going to play 4th edition." They didn't care, what it did, what it looked like. They were just not going to do it. And it's because, a lot of people invested a ton of money. And when you talk about 3rd edition sales and all the sales from all the different books, the amount of material that was published for 3rd edition was mind-boggling. Every week there would be book upon like 20-30 books that you could get that were brand new. Now, quality on them was all over the map too. Like, you would have some that were fantastic, but the majority of them were garbage. And you would, your GMs would have to do a lot of work to vet the books to make sure it was something they could use or not. And with 4th edition, you didn't have that. But when Pathfinder sort of took up the reins of 3rd, a lot of people just said, hey, instead of just being honest and saying, "Hey, I've already knows this game and I want to keep playing it," and there was this weird backlash from 4th, and a lot of people that hate 4th edition, I would say, had never even played it. But it is what it is. 4th edition went on. It still sold well for us. But Pathfinder was very popular and sort of kept that ball rolling. And then, but now Pathfinder with 2nd edition is seeing a lot of the same backlash as like D&D 4th edition had. You had people who are just like, "No, I don't really care for it," and you got some that are like playing it and it's fine. And it's really like, what do you have and what are you comfortable with? Because like, as long as you got like a core book for most games, you don't need to buy other stuff just because it's out of print. As long as you got it, you're fine. You can keep playing it. Nobody says you have to stop if a new edition comes out. But it is, I do think it's funny watching Pathfinder players now giving me the same answer that they did about D&D when 4th edition came out. Like, "Oh, I'm not going to play 2nd edition. I've got 1st." So
yeah, It's interesting with Pathfinder because the other thing is that its second edition does actually make changes. It does substantially deviate it from 3.5 in ways that first edition Pathfinder didn't. Also, Pathfinder was also material, like the amount of material they put out for their first round was obscene. Like,
Oh, there's tons.
yeah, they seem to have also learned not to overproduce. But although
it definitely seems that Wizards of the Coast are more sparing with their book releases.
Yes.
I mean, and it's an easier cycle to manage. I mean, compared to compared to third edition, it seems like maybe you get a couple of books.
Even
you get a couple of books a year, maybe.
With third and fourth, you would get like official books. Like for fourth edition, it was almost like 2 books a month, 1 or 2 books a month. And with third edition, it was like official, you would get at least 1 a month, but they would also make a lot more of these thinner splat books,
right?
And you would get a lot of those. And now it's definitely like 1 a quarter is about what it seems like, and that seems to be they found sort of that nice even like number to put out. And when you're asking somebody to dump $50 on a book because all they make are hardback books,
right?
You know, you can't just flood the market with that. Like people can't afford to buy that all the time.
It is interesting that they include though, like with the setting books are thinner than they used to be, and more open, and for Wizards of the Coast. But a whole lot of the rules are in adventure books now, which was not the case prior. So that's an interesting change.
Yeah, I think they're trying to make it to where everybody feels comfortable buying everything.
It's right. I mean, I think it's a smart strategy. If you already see 4 or 5 books a year, you can say, hey, why don't you buy the 4 or 5 books a year? Whereas if you're selling 2 books a month, no one could keep up with that. And to pivot on that, you know, that is to a certain degree the problem that Games Workshop is having with their hectic schedule release. But I want to dial back that question back a little bit and ask, so we talked about role-play games and, you know, the changing demographic of role-play games. Would you say there's a parallel development in miniature games, or at least in miniature collecting?
No. Board games, definitely. There's, you know, the audience is very open. It's a good mix. Miniature games are one of the things that you still see primarily male-driven market, and like. So I was a big fan of the game War Machine, which is put out by Privateer Press. That's what I ran my convention on. It was nice because when they came out, one of the things they did is they had a good mix of male and female protagonists. The models were not, you know, like it's not all, you know, dudes at war. It looked like
or it's not all boob plate.
Yeah. I mean, there was a good amount of that still, but it was a little more toned down. But what we found is with War Machine, there was a small but definitely larger female audience than there was for 40K or fantasy, and I think that was because they, you know, it's the whole idea that representation matters, and if you are represented, you're going to be more comfortable, you know, checking out a game. And when, you know, you have a guy showing his girlfriend like, hey, we've got all these models and this game had like 40K or fantasy is primarily male unless you get the female model army or the female army, and then in War Machine it's mixed in where some of the more stronger characters in there, it's a mix of male and female. There's not like one that's dominant over the other. It's a pretty strong mix. And with that game, you actually saw a good group of players, whereas you see a few women play Games Workshop stuff, but it's not enough to where I feel like it's made a noticeable difference.
Even with a game like Age of Sigmar, where they seem to be definitely trying to make it more representative.
And there are more. But it still feels like it's not as noticeable.
So you would say the kind of changes that have affected the role play game market and the kind of people involved, there's been a little bit of that in the miniature industry, in the miniature market, but nowhere near the same degree.
Correct.
And would you say that the problem is less the product and more the community, or because if War Machine is doing like representative models, the question then is like, why is this not having the same result? I mean, Games Workshop also seems to be trying to move in that direction, but so is it? So would you say it's the community, and if so, why?
I think so. I would equate it to, if we look how role playing was 20 years ago, 15 years ago, where it was a primarily male driven. There were still females that played it, but it was primarily male driven market. And then as it became more normalized and people grew up with it and are introducing their family to it, now it's going to take another generation. It may be to get to where it's like it's more normalized. I think it's a long process, and it's probably not the most comfortable game for people to like. And I'm going to use 40K just because it's the biggest game out there. But if you were to go to an event for that, it's very very testosterone heavy, and it would probably not be the most comfortable for some women, and they would stick out like a sore thumb. And some women are cool with it and handle it really well, and others it can make uncomfortable, and until they get past that part, it's going to be tough to make it a noticeable change. But I think it's happening as more of these people are like growing up and having families and realizing it's more than just a boys club. And if they're, and I think that's why you see like these companies trying to pivot and change and be more responsive to that. And some companies do it better than others, just the way it works.
So are you telling us, Carl, that these companies, rather than following George Soros's woke liberal agenda designed to turn us all into cucks, are responding to market forces? Is that would that be an accurate?
I mean, that it happens. It's just it happens. I don't know what to say.
Because this is one of the things I find very interesting about the discourse. It's very much thrown into the culture war, when in fact, like, there's a perfectly like explainable market explanation for these transformations.
When you see somebody like Games Workshop making like the hey, if you don't like this, that, or the other, and it's basically like, yeah, we're trying to be inclusive and make everybody feel welcome, and if you don't like that, we don't want you. And then you get a portion of their audience who gets mad about that. It's like no, it's like, I would rather sell to everybody than a small section. That's just basic capitalism.
Nerds who grew up in the 80s and 90s are probably a declining demographic over time. Just saying.
True.
So, so I mean, one of the things though that I've thought about when we talk about this, and we talked a lot about specific games, but the gaming practices are interesting. One, RPGs kind of have followed the publishing industry in its model, and that has, having worked in it, I know all kinds of problems that are unique to publishing, including a bunch of weird deals that were made to keep publishing viable in like World War II that we still go by for some weird reason. For those of you who don't know, like, what happens to remainder books? Well, they just get pulped. Like, but has Kickstarter, and we know Amazon's affected everybody's business, particularly because of the way they force up at like almost wholesale discounts upon everyone. But and that of course favors people like Wizards, because Wizards can't afford to offer deep discounts on Amazon, even at the cost of their their primary small store distribution.
As a note to that, it is often like we can often if we wanted to, we could buy our like D&D players handbooks cheaper on Amazon than we can order it from our wholesalers. And those are sold by Wizards of the Coast.
That's
It's
insane.
one of our big issues with them, and they just turn a blind eye. They don't care. They see that as probably like a loss leader for them. It's like if they can sell, get it in the hands of more people, that means more people are playing. But
Well, because if you're a company and you're not on Amazon, you're going to have your market share gazumped, right?
I
Because
mean,
people will just buy things on Amazon.
It really depends on scale, though, because like small indie games probably don't benefit from Amazon at all. I noticed they tend not to use them.
Yeah, like you've got some companies that will. You have companies, even like some bigger companies that have their MAP policy, which is their minimum advertised price, where it's like you can sell this, but you can't sell it more than 20% off, and that includes Amazon. And sometimes Amazon stays on it, and sometimes they don't. And it's just something you'll in our like various groups online, like Facebook retailer groups, you'll see people complain about that probably more than anything else. Like, oh, this person's breaking the MAP policy, and they're deep discounting games where they shouldn't be.
But to a certain degree, Carl, would you say the game shop is insulated a bit from Amazon when compared to other shops, because the activities taking place that aren't just purchasing products, but also the gaming takes place there?
Yeah. And that's like, I've always been a big proponent of like, we build communities first and sell games after that, because it makes it much easier to fight online stuff. It's like if I've built a community of players and I want them to go, oh, I want to go buy it from Carl, instead of thinking of like, it's like, oh, I could buy this on Amazon, but I want to go see Carl and I want to buy it there. And if I can get people to think that, then that, I've won half my battle there, just trying to get them to, walk in the store just to chat. And then if they're comfortable here, then they're gonna, eat the extra cost it is to buy from us, then they'll save by going to Amazon and not have anybody to interact with.
And not only that, they won't have anyone to play with either.
Exactly. You've got a built-in community of players here, and no matter if it's board games or card games or whatever. So like it seems like Amazon isn't much like, as far as card games go, we don't see much of that being driven by Amazon. You do have a lot of role players but the board game market is where Amazon hurts the most.
Well, before we get on to board games, I do want to ask one thing. There's been a lot of chitter chatter on the internet about Games Workshop having peaked and now their shady business practices and exploitative business practices are kind of coming back to hurt them in the ass. Are you seeing any of that? Is there Games Workshop fatigue? Are people, or are things as at least in your shop, are things as hectic as ever?
We're still selling stuff just fine. I know that I always call, people who complain about Games Workshop, it's like battered wives syndrome. Is they'll complain, but oh, I still love them, and they'll still, people will still, shell out the money to buy their stuff.
Carl, don't let me buy Games Workshop products. Don't let me do it. Don't let me come crawling back to GW. I've left her for Mantic, and it's over.
But I mean, this isn't anything new. This is just like maybe on a larger scale, but it's nothing new. We've seen this, I don't know how many times, of like, people complain about their price hikes or complain about one thing or another, but then it evens out. So I mean, I like when I started doing more of the ordering, and when I started working here, our biggest competition for Games Workshop was Games Workshop themselves. And they've, I think, realized that they have to work a little bit with us. Although I think now we're seeing a new era of them trying to compete in different ways by shorting stores' product so they can try to sell more of it on their online store, instead of just them going, hey, we're going to have this awesome sale that nobody else has access to. like they
Right.
used to back in the day. But
basically artificial scarcity in shops.
yes, I think that's our biggest issue. But and they've got a really nice veil to sort of hide that behind right now with the shipping issues that a
Right.
lot of places are having. So you don't, and because they aren't, there's no transparency in knowing what's actually going on. It's pretty it's pretty hard to call them out like, oh, you're actually out of this, or no, you're just shorting everybody so you can sell more of it online.
And are there any companies that are even making a dent, or at least becoming more popular to Games Workshop? I mean, because when I was growing up, Games Workshop was really the only miniature game in town. But it seems like there are more options today. But how are they doing vis-a-vis
It's
GW?
very niche. So but Games Workshop is still probably 90% of the miniature game market.
Right.
When you're talking about actual games. Now, if you talk about just miniatures, then you have other things. But now with like Fantasy Flight, Asmodee has Star Wars Legion, X-Wing, the Marvel superhero game. Those have a lot of fans, but it's still, I mean, we sell a lot of that, but it's still like a fraction of what Games Workshop sells.
And how's
So
3D printers? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Varn. Sorry.
I was just going to ask you, are Asmodee's Fantasy Flight Asmodee's business practices significantly better than Game Workshops?
Business practice. I mean, they did have they had a map policy. They have a map policy where you can't advertise any products more than 20%, which I think is good. But they will suspend that map policy anytime that they know that Amazon's running a sale, so Amazon can do whatever they want during okay, and they'll let us suspend it. But it's like if we sold games that cheap, we're going to go out of business. So it's not like we're going to do that. So that is like a minor quibble, I guess. But I mean, they're right now. I think my only complaint about Asmodee is they've bought out one of the bigger online stores, and so we're trying to figure out how that's going to affect our business. And if they go into a Games Workshop mode where they're funneling product to that online store as opposed to the stores around the country like ours, how's that going to affect games overall?
Can you talk a little bit more about that purchase? Who's involved and what exactly Asmodee produce and why they're such a big player in the market?
So Asmodee is, I believe, was a French board game company who were bought out by, and I may be getting part of this wrong, and I apologize if I am, but they got bought out by a corporation that was using, I mean, it's like any other big business that has subsidiaries of various kinds. They bought out that corporation as another feather in their hat, and then when they would sell, then they would break it off and sell it to whoever and try to make money on it. It's like like a glorified stock for them. But they put enough money into it where they started going around snatching up a ton of smaller publishers. And now Asmodee went from being a very small niche company to controlling a huge percentage of the board game market.
What board games would you say people would know if you're, a board game player?
So Settlers of Catan is like the number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That game's been out forever. That was a staple of Mayfair games for years and years. And Mayfair
And normies play that game. Normies play that game. Oh
yeah, no, it's in most board games anymore. I would say, what you would call a normie is just a typical family, and more and more of those people are playing board games like it's a no big deal, and they're out hunting for these better games like that. And Catan sort of started that whole trend. But Catan was Mayfair Games' number one selling game by far. And they sold it to Asmodee, and they bought the whole Catan license from them, and the name and games, the whole 9 yards. And then they bought out Fantasy Flight, which was a huge board game maker in the U.S. anyway, and had all kinds of different games. And I mean, they would just snatch up little ones here and there. Now, I would say it's an easy 50%, of the market of like top selling board games. So if you are a game store, you have to deal with them.
Mm.
And they've been. You go ahead, Ron.
Do we see this tendency towards monopolization across the industry? I mean, we kind of seen it with, even with, I mean, there are countervailing tendencies in like, say, indie games where, between Drive Through RPG and Kickstarters, there's a lot of them. But I'm thinking of Asmodee, I'm thinking of Wizards, but I'm also thinking of just how many of these, like Free Liga and Mordifius Games as far as distribution, just buying up, in the case of Mordifius, buying up distribution rights to all kinds of foreign games, be they Swedish or not. Are we seeing this tendency towards monopolization across the industry?
I mean, it's that kind of thing. I think in the gaming industry is more of a distribution model than a monopolization model.
Okay.
Where they're not trying to, most of those like Modifius they're not trying to corner the, market on role-playing games, but they are providing a service to a lot of people who may not get their stuff, released in the US as easy. And we're now able to get that, like, stuff that we normally wouldn't be able to get. The board game market was very similar, where like you would have somebody like Mayfair or Rio Grande back in the day would buy the rights to do a board game from random German designer, and they would say, hey, we're going to publish it in the US for you. And they would do the US publication rights, and they would produce it for so long, and then they would re-up the deal or they wouldn't. But it was a way for stuff to get released in the US that normally wouldn't see the light of day. And I think you're seeing a lot of that with stuff like Modifius. But Asmodee feels different, where it's like they have the capital and the ability to go around and buy up companies left and right. And it feels like, I hate to use the term oppressive, but it's definitely like, it's noticeable.
And they're snowballing, right? They just get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Seems
and now,
like it.
which was did they buy Miniature Mart? Was it that they bought?
They bought Miniature Market, which is one of the bigger online game stores. And I guess the information about that didn't come out until after Asmodee sold to a video game company, a big corporation that owned them. And in the stockholders meeting, it came out that they had bought Miniature Market and nobody knew about it. And then everybody was like, whoa, hold up. So that's why, like, a lot of people's like antennas went up when that happened. So we can keep an eye on it, make sure, like, if Miniature Market all of a sudden has access to a lot of games that we don't, and we're theoretically going through the same distribution channels, there's going to be an issue there, I think.
Right, because a lot of these people are trying to get in on the increased popularity of nerd culture, and controlling distribution is obviously a good moneymaker. So I guess, like, the last question I kind of want to ask, unless there's something you want to add about Asmodee, is about the pandemic and how that's affected the game store, and what has it driven new people. So how have you guys been faring? Because retail has been taken to the cleaners by the pandemic. It's been disastrous for walk-in stores, but I would assume that your dynamic is slightly different. So,
or is very different. The pandemic has actually helped us out a ton. And as weird as that sounds, especially from a business model where we do a lot of events here at the store, and like our events are sort of like our primary advertising, because we don't typically do TV or radio ads. But when people were starting to look for things to do with their families because they're stuck in the house with them, they've reverted to role-playing games and board games and miniature games. And people who used to play, like we'd had people who played miniature games for a long time have come back and they're like, oh, well, I'm stuck in the house, so I'm going to buy a bunch of models and actually sit down and paint them. And then I'll play when I get to play. Or you just have families that'll come in and buy, board games. Board games have been a huge seller throughout the last couple of years. I mean, they've already were doing well, but then it just sort of put them into overdrive. And same thing with role playing games. It was amazing. I thought for sure people would get sick of playing role playing games, on online, but there's still tons of people who are just now playing with their families, and on top of systems like Roll20 and other online platforms where you can hop on and play and get your games in safety. So, but yeah, I can't complain because we've actually had a great year.
Well, good. Somebody at least is. Maybe it's a pandemic planned by the roleplay game industry. There we go. There's a new theory. There's a new theory to put out there right now. Varn,
big mask and wizards, I guess. No, I had been wondering about that, particularly with like Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds and all that, just seeming to grow like exponentially. I've noticed more and more, like even on Kickstarters, if you're serious, if you're not doing something super niche, you have to now produce the stuff for Fantasy Grounds and Roll20. So do you think that's going to remain after because I think it might actually. I think this may have become like a perma fixture.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say sure. I mean, ideally it remains. But it's the idea that these are new learned habits that people are, getting into. They are, like trying out these new hobbies, and some of them will stick, some of them will keep playing Magic, and some of them will keep playing 40K, and some of them will drop out. But stuff that you can do with everybody, like board games, are gonna stick. And the more people realize that there's more to play than just Monopoly in life and Uno, they're going to be looking for better stuff, and that's where we've got. I think our, like in the future, it's more. I think we were sort of hitting on it earlier with like Kickstarter stuff, but Kickstarter is going to be, like, to me, is our one of our big competitors in the future. And it's like, and even right now we try to like figure out like what is going on Kickstarter that we can just ignore because they've already sold to their whole clientele, and what stuff is actually going to translate to bigger audiences. And that's tough to do.
Yeah, I was wondering about, except for something that like funds itself in 5 minutes, it does seem like that's a pretty big risk on the part of game shops and whatnot. Particularly, I mean, I have seen, again, I follow Kickstarter. I support a lot of stuff. I've noticed a shift in the last 3 years to being more supportive of stores and
yes,
and in the Kickstarting packages, but it still seems like, as a store, how do you know? Like, because unless it's immediately funded, you don't know what's going to catch and what isn't, and how anyone really has either.
Have you have you gone in as a shop to any Kickstarters? Are there any Kickstarters you jumped in on?
We try to only back with companies that we know are going to follow through, and we're not going to have to worry about not getting it. And then we also make sure that they've got a decent retailer program set up. So Cool Mini or Not, which they do some like silly stuff from here and there, but they actually have a pretty good retailer program set up to where we can go in and get all the stuff that's in a Kickstarter. But unlike like the general public who have to like pony up the entire amount when the Kickstarter is finished, we put down like a small deposit, and then we don't have to pay until right before it ships. So
the Cool Mini or Not has some very cool games. I played the Valhalla game. I can't remember. Blood Rage. Love that game. Really good game. Actually, that on that point, as a purveyor of board games and miniature games and role play games, do you have any board games that you could recommend to our viewers that you think are new, exciting, and worth checking out?
Oh man, that's one of the things I love about working in a game store is like literally like week to week. It's like Christmas because you get to see all the new stuff coming in throughout the year. Trying to think off the top of my head because we're like we're also in a mode of being out of stock of everything and waiting for restocks to come in. Nemesis, if you can find it, is one of those that's like a pretty big game, but it's it's sort of a Aliens, the board game, where you're
Mm-hmm.
trapped on a ship and you may or may or you have your own goals and the group has a goal of trying to survive and you're trying to like meet your own goals while surviving the aliens that are running around attacking everybody. That one's pretty cool. And that's going to be one just because of how hard it is to find, that when stores get it in, they'll turn around and sell it really quick, and then you have to wait another 6 months for a restock. But if you can find that game's fantastic. There's, man, all kinds of good small games of various kinds. It just sort of depends on really what, I don't know. Board games are like, I always say they're like going to a movie. Like there's a million board games out there and a million different, styles. And I may hate one style and you may love it. It's like, hey, if we go to a movie, you may like romantic comedies and I don't, or you may like horror and I don't, and it's just a matter of finding what you like. There's certain types that I don't like, but I know are still good games, and that's gonna always, hit with people.
She likes cops and he likes Euro games.
Yeah.
Final question, Varn, before we end the show. Anything you want to ask before we wrap up?
I suppose I just ask if you had a prediction about what may be changing in the gaming industry in the next 2 to 3 years, what would that prediction be?
I think you're going to see. Well, I think you've seen companies like Wizards of the Coast with some of their games, like Magic the Gathering and D&D, make a big push for more inclusivity with like getting different types of people to play. I think you're going to definitely still see that from the miniature games. But I think it's just going to be more of the same for the next few years. The big thing is going to be how like are probably things that the normal people aren't going to see. It's going to be how games are sold. Right now, there's a there's a backlash with Kickstarter with some smaller publishers because Kickstarter came out and said that they were going to support blockchain stuff, and that I don't even claim to know everything about that. I'm too busy to look into crypto, and I don't have the money to throw into it. And but I don't understand it. So, but I know that it's irritated a lot of publishers. I think you're going to see probably more small publishers go the route of developing their own in-house Kickstarter type programs, where they're going to try to just effectively pre-sell stuff themselves, instead of going through various distribution models or through Kickstarter. And I mean, there's been companies that have done this in the past. This isn't anything new.
HeroQuest had its own when they did the HeroQuest release.
That's through Hasbro, and they're giant corporations.
They're a giant corp, but they had the resources to do it, so they didn't go through Kickstarter, right?
Yeah, well, they could have made that game on their own. They didn't need like Kickstarter. The original
it was kind of bullshit. It was kind of bullshit that they did that, and that's like the problem with the Kickstarter model. It's like it's pretty good for small companies and people who wouldn't have the resources to do it, but it can be very exploitative if these like big companies just do it in order to like avoid deploying capital for a project that they don't.
They lose out on. So for the bigger projects, these companies that don't need Kickstarter are effectively using it as pre-sale, and they lose that 15 to 20% going through Kickstarter as opposed to 50% through a normal distribution chain. So for them, it's just they get a bigger percentage by pre-selling it than you understand that, but also eventually I would like to think that will come to a point where it's not going to be as easy to do, because with there being if you are undercutting game stores like that, it's going to make it harder for them to get their product in front of people. But like the board game people that buy, like the board game fans are so ate up with FOMO that if they think they're missing out on, you know, 1 or 2 card promo pack that is only going to be available on the Kickstarter, they
They'll
will
pay it.
they'll pay it, and they'll pay $200 and wait 2 years for it because they've got something that, you know, they wouldn't have otherwise. And it's and that's a whole other a whole other topic that I can get into, but it's a pretty funny thing to watch when like people like going out of their way to pay a ton extra for board game expansions that they won't play 80% of.
Yeah.
Well, Carl, it has been 1 hour. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, sharing your expertise with us. It was actually very like one of the most interesting interviews we've done for a while. That we've done so far, because you know it's really interesting to sort of see underneath the hood of the gaming industry and what it looks like to be on the front line of nerddom. So so everybody make sure to like and subscribe to both VarnVlog and to This Is Revolution. Check out, if you ever come through Springfield, Missouri, can you tell us about the name of your store, Carl, and where it is?
Metagames Unlimited. We're right at the intersection of Highway 65 and Sunshine Street, and we would love to see people come through. You can come visit us on your way to Branson, Missouri.
Yeah, when everybody's hitting to go see the Yakov Smirnoff comedy special, right? In Soviet Russia, game plays you. But so it's so check out Metagames if you're coming through Springfield. Like and subscribe to our 2 channels. Become a patron to VarnVlog or This Is Revolution if you have the means, and if you would like to. As we now do, I'll put the disclaimer. Please remember, when supporting a podcast, you aren't doing politics. You're supporting the entertainment you enjoy, and maybe it's educational in the way Sesame Street is educational. So, with that said, thank you again, and we are out.